Leprosy and the plague, or it could be worse. Today I'm going to make you all very happy by talking through some of the times in especially Europe's history when there's been something we call an epidemic in individual societies, or we could even say a pandemic, at least as far as Europe is concerned. I'm not going to explain those words because they are painfully familiar to us now. But I am not going to be talking about the current crisis. I'm going to be talking about leprosy and the plague. So, this is a lecture by me, Andrew Thomas, from Østfold University College for One School for All, and I would like you to watch this by Tuesday, the 24th of August. And please do watch it before we get to the lesson, because I'm going to assume that you already know about this when we get to the lesson. Okay, let's get first to leprosy. And the reason I'm talking about leprosy is because of the work of Michel Foucault, which I've set up for reading for this lesson. When he finished his PhD handed in his PhD in 1960, I think he surprised a lot of people because his PhD was about the history of madness. And so everyone was ready for a philosopher to write, or maybe a psychiatrist, somebody who had worked he had some practical work with medicine and psychiatry at the time. He wasn't a qualified doctor. And they expected some philosophical and existential reflections. And the opening words of this book are, "At the end of the Middle Ages, leprosy disappeared from the Western world." Why was he interested in leprosy when in a book about madness? Well, one of the main reasons he was interested in leprosy was because he was interested in exclusion and inclusion and issues of what kind of people can contribute to society, and whether we need their contributions, and what we do with people whose contributions we feel we don't need, or what we do with the contributions of people we feel we do need, but we need to maximize on their contributions. But first and foremost, he was interested in inclusion and exclusion, at least as far as leprosy is concerned. And he was talking about the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, there was a very well established technology for dealing with leprosy, which was simply exclusion. Exclusion at the gate. People arrive, they want to come in, but they can't come in because the rules about leprosy were you have to keep people outside. And so leprosy hospitals, which were built up in the course of the Middle Ages, are established outside the city gates, and the city gates themselves are controlled to keep people with leprosy outside. And so there was a certain area outside the town where people had got this far but no further. They couldn't go further into the town, but they didn't want to abandon the town. The town was where things were happening, where people had money, where food was being traded. And so in order to survive, you have to survive near a town. You couldn't be a rural worker. So they needed to be around the town, but not inside the town. So outside the town, there were these areas of exclusion. You could say maybe a little bit like hotel quarantine today. But Foucault was right. At the end of the Middle Ages, around about the time that the St. Jürgen hospital is established in Bergen, leprosy had essentially been wiped out of Europe, or at least if not wiped out, certainly reduced enormously. It was no longer a massive social problem, because this was a good way of solving the leprosy problem. Even though they didn't really know how leprosy spread or what it was at least effective. Of course, it does mean that people who had leprosy at the time were sacrificed on the altar of this technology, which was based on a lack of science. But essentially it was effective because you keep people out of the town, then there is a much bigger space, and they're not sitting up against each other as they would do if they were living within the town. So they were able to socially distance. But essentially it was a way of exclusion. Now, later on, Foucault talks more about another disease, the plague, famously arriving in Europe in catastrophic ways in the middle of the 1300s. Although there are various, and it's difficult to say whether it's always the same disease, but there are various waves of the plague in European history. And the problem with the plague was that the body is dangerous. You need to do something about these dangerous bodies. And if people are kept outside or excluded, then still you've got to have contact with them. And the plague is so contagious that whoever it is that moves the body or controls the body will themselves be infected. So you need to do something about these dangerous bodies. And this is when the quarantine system comes into place. Quarantine, which is not interested necessarily in excluding bodies, but in controlling bodies and knowing exactly where they are. The plague system, controlled by these famous plague doctors, these famous rather scary plague doctors, essentially says you've got to stay within the town and you stay within a particular house in one particular place. We're not going to keep you out. We're going to keep you put. You have to stay put. And like I say, this is when the introduction of the quarantine system, quarantaine, which means 40 days, was moved to control these bodies. So you've got the leprosy system, keep people out of the town, and the plague system, keep people controlled, contained. And we could maybe say that these are the two technologies of controlling borders and self-isolation or social distancing today. Essentially, during the plague, there was a progression. So people were saying the leprosy technology is not going to work. We need to use this plague technology. So there was a historical development. But you see you see both technologies being used in various situations, and particularly we see them used in situations outside the simple control of leprosy and the plague. And Foucault talks about how this political administrative system works in a number of different spheres, and we're going to talk about them in terms of education. But before we do that, let's talk about the two systems and their main characteristics. First of all, leprosy is all about exclusion. Plague is all about inclusion. There's nothing moral about this. It's simply that that exclusion doesn't work with the plague. And there was a great deal of rhetoric in early modernity. We're talking about the 1600s and 1700s, when the plague system was much more prevalent in society, in institutions in society, which no longer kept people out of towns but had institutions within towns. That inclusion is better. And here we're not talking about how people feel. We're talking about what is most effective for society. Leprosy model, people are closed out, plague closed in. In the leprosy system, we're talking about a pure community. The community is not to have any leprosy within. Whereas the plague system, the community is being purified. We are containing the plague within the community, and we're solving the problem within the community. So it's being purified, but it is not being kept pure. In leprosy, the walls are around the community, but in the plague system, the walls are within the community. It doesn't matter whether you're in or outside the society, but once you are inside society, you need to be kept in particular places, and you're not allowed to move beyond these walls. The sentries are placed on gates in leprosy in order to control who comes in and out, whereas with the plague model, the sentries are placed on streets to control the people within the buildings in which they're staying. The quarantine takes place outside, and these leprosy hospitals were placed outside the city, and there were lots of institutions controlled at the gate of the city. The plague system, the quarantine takes place at home. It's what we would today call home quarantine. Binary categories in leprosy. We're talking about, do you have leprosy or do you not? If you do, then you stay outside. If you don't, then you'll stay inside. Much more categories are available in the plague system. Are you healthy? Are you sick? But also, are you movable? Can you move around? Are you dangerous? Are you contagious? A greater scientific set of nuances rather than this binary in or out. Limited political power, which is to say it's just on the basis of the gates. The gate is the place. The gate and the walls are the place where the political power is exerted. Whereas unlimited political power, so long as people are within the town in the plague system, unlimited in the sense of you can control people, control their movements, say where they are and what they've got to do, and when ultimately they die, you control the bodies and you can exclude people or include people. The point is, it's this police power, which is unlimited when there's a state of exception, when there's an emergency. You restrict bodies, you control bodies. You restrict bodies, as in you say, this is an okay body, this is not an okay body. Whereas in the plague system, you control bodies. You say they have to be right here and nowhere else, or they need to be moved from this place to this place. But the point is they are controlled, not just restricted. is ritually controlled with leprosy, and there was an entire set of rituals that we can't go into here around including and excluding people and declaring people free of leprosy, and this was biblically referred to. This is something that is described in a great extent in the Hebrew Bible. Whereas in the plague, that it's a matter of documentation first and foremost. But both of them rely on registers for who is pure and who is impure in both technologies. So those are the two models, and these are the things that lie behind the inclusion-exclusion dichotomy in education. After the plague model started to be used in Europe, the leprosy actually returned and started spreading again. It turns out that the leprosy model is most effective for leprosy, and the plague model doesn't work particularly well for dealing with leprosy. And it stayed around in Europe, these greater numbers, after the Middle Ages had dealt with that problem, we thought, until Hansen's disease was discovered about 148 years ago, which is to say he discovered the bacterium which actually is what causes what we call leprosy or Hansen's disease today, so that it could be isolated and eradicated. And today the World Health Organization note that it's absolutely curable. It shouldn't be a problem in any modern society. But there are still 200,000 cases worldwide every year, over half of which have been occurring in India, particularly India, of course, with its problems of poverty and variable health system. Our problem in the world, as ever, is not contagion only, but economy.